Here's what I'm pondering and thinking about is a course on respectful communication. It's gone through some different titles, and it's around interpersonal communication and conflict. I've taught communications courses for many years in universities, colleges, communities, always trying to learn about communication. I often suck at it as much as other people may be. I've seen some courses that I quite appreciate. I've seen some courses that I've kind of find are a bit of a piece of junk. And there is no one way, as what I found, necessarily to communicate, but there's some pretty strong principles about communicating with our own selves and communicating with others. The world is a vast place with billions of people, many cultures, many languages, many ways of communicating and communicating with each other across cultures, between cultures, in families, beyond families, in communities, and otherwise. So this course that I've been thinking about, and I'll lead you through just what I've been prototyping so far, is around just respectful communication and conflict. And I've got it built around some different pieces. One might call it the ecological model or a systems model, where there's an individual nested in amongst relationships with others, and that is nested within relationships with institutions, which is then nested within relationships of structures such as countries and otherwise. So let me lead you through a visual diagram of how I've been picturing this coming together. So there are two key actors in communication. So there starts with me, myself, an individual, and that's sort of at the center of this diagram. And the history of the thought process around the ecological model, some suggest it was a researcher by the name of Urie Bronfenbrenner who looked at this model as a way for a child to develop. And I'm certainly not necessarily comparing child development, although we all have an inner child, there are a few of them. But it is a method of thinking around development of an individual and their relationships, not just with themselves, but the greater surroundings within. And so there's a self at the center, we can see in the circle here, and there is a whole set of communication pieces and elements and principles that occur in how we communicate with ourselves. And that's the intrapersonal part of communication. And there's things such as our values, our personalities, our identities. Think of personal versus professional. So the self can be just intrapersonal communication with ourselves can be complicated as it is without even starting to think about that relationship with others around us. And so in this model, I've got the others, the relationship with others surrounding the self, and that is the interpersonal, so in between. And so similarly, you take a self, me, and another, you, and each of those are a complex set of relationships and experiences and ways of socialization, cultures, languages, ways of thinking, ways of being. It's a pretty complicated place. It's no surprise that communication can go sour and not work out so well sometimes. And so the others can expand everywhere from families to colleagues to peers to neighbors in our communities to the grocery store and interacting with virtual strangers essentially. And then now with the creation of the internet and how that is expanding in Web 3.0 and otherwise, it expands out into the greater world, into potentially accessing, say for example with YouTube, 2.5 billion users. It's a significant amount of the adult and older youth population that has access to YouTube. And so there's methods of communicating there. So if we think about a self that's nested within relationships with others, we then expand out into the relationships within systems. And systems are the institutions that are around us. So for example, we can think of an institution like education. Education and schooling have a big impact in who we are as individuals and who the people around us may be. And people that we're communicating with may have gone through different schooling systems or different ways of being raised. Maybe they were homeschooled and I was raised in a K-12 system. So there's differences between how different people interact with different institutions. And so institutions can also be things like the institution of marriage and how that changes over time and how much that impacts people's lives, both the act of getting married and sometimes children that happen within marriages or outside of marriages, the breakdown of marriages. So those types of institutions have a huge impact on all of us, as well as how we communicate and how we potentially communicate respectfully. Then out and around the systems are the bigger, broader structures. So these are the big pieces. So think of things like the Constitution. Where I live, it's the Constitution of Canada. There are things like the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. There are other big ticket items, such as for some people, and for example, where I live in Canada, the Indian Act is a structural system, a structural component that has a huge influence on individuals and the rest of the country and those that live within it. The United Nations declarations on different components, such as the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, that's a big structural piece, as is now in Canada the federal legislation that recognizes the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, as well as in British Columbia, one of the first provinces to pass an act recognizing that. So those are the structural pieces that influence what it means to be a citizen, what it means to be on a visa and immigration rules. So big structural pieces that influence systems, which influence others and influence each individual at the center of that. And then if we think about this in a 3D model, and this was something that Bronfenbrenner added to his model, the ecological model or bioecological model, was the idea of time and history. So like a few of the examples that I've mentioned, we can think of the changes with education, we can think of changes in definition of marriage and the laws and the different pieces of legislation that also influence that. And so those time and history has a big influence on how we go about things. We can think of the time and influence on things like treaties, for example, and both treaties with Indigenous people, but also treaties that ended wars. And so those are all the different components influencing each of those. Then within, and wrapping this up, thinking through some of the critical concepts within that overall model is there are language and languages. So I'm communicating here in English. And if you can see me on video, then there's a certain amount of body language that you may be picking up, facial expression, different types of language. Or if I was potentially doing this in sign language, there's another type of language. So there are many different types of language and languages. That's a critical concept within communication. Then messages and messaging. They are very closely connected with languages, but there's many ways of sending a message. Those can be through various channels. And sometimes in any communication scenario, there might be multiple messages coming in multiple different ways. The raise of an eyebrow can communicate one thing. The move of a hand or a certain gesture with the hand or the face can mean many different things in many different places. So messaging and messages are a critical component. A third is listening. Absolutely essential part of communication, and we listen in many ways. We can listen with our eyes, we can listen with our ears. I only hear in one, so that influences the ways in which I listen or not. And there's also that balanced listening, balanced with speaking. And there are different ways of speaking. Again, if we use sign language as an example, I can speak using my hands, and many of us do anyway. Some people are more hand talkers and the hands are going. Different cultures tend to have more hands. And then that moves into the fourth critical concept of emotions. And emotions are right at the heart and core of communication, both internally, intrapersonal with each of us individually, but also out into the broader, and how emotion has an absolutely huge impact on the ways that we communicate. The fifth is the context and the environments, and you can start to see how all of these are interlinked. They're like little circles that would jam up against each other. In the context and the environments, think, for example, the difference between personal and professional. Here I am shooting a video in my home, as opposed to in the past I've shot videos in my workplace. Those can be different contexts and environments, or whether I'm shooting video outside, which I do quite a bit of, or shooting video inside. I find it has a different impact on what I'm thinking about and how I communicate. Then the sixth in there is identities. And I'd mentioned that in that core self at the center of this model. And the identities, we can have several within us. And then we can also have different identities that come out in different situations. When I play sports, for example, I can be a pretty competitive individual. There's a competitive identity that may come out in certain situations. But maybe that doesn't come out if I'm playing a family game of hockey out on the hockey rink. But then if I go out and play in a community setting, I might be a little bit more competitive. So that's the shifting of identities. And then the last one, a core piece that is, I think, a really critical piece in here is conflict. And conflict is an interesting word, I find, because it essentially means to strike together. And that's what we do as individuals, even within our own selves, but then interacting with others. If you get married or even have siblings that you have relationships with, or parents, or other folks that have raised us, we interact with our community, and conflict can come up all of the time. And it doesn't have to be a negative. I'll often say the example of in physics, conflict is actually what creates transformation. And so think of water that goes from being cold to boiling, creating steam. That's what the original engines were created out of, and that was a transformational change for humankind in the creation of engines, steam engines. And so conflict can be really critical part of communication. Navigating it well and respectfully is also what I hope to get at with the core of some of these modules. So that's what I'm thinking about in terms of a course and some mini modules on respectful communication. I've seen some courses that do this well, and I think there's some pieces that could be added to this. And my vision with this is to create it so that it's somewhat of a living course. I'd like to be able to get feedback, hear from people, have resources, chat with different folks about it, and create a bit of a course that starts to come together as a little ecosystem of itself. What works well in communication and what doesn't work well. There's differences in how people can communicate across genders and across identities. That's a pretty hot topic item these days around identities and gender and self-identity and group identity and legislative identity. These are complex pieces. Interpersonal and intrapersonal or internal communication can be a really complicated place. And that's what I hope to explore in this course. Let me know what you think. Leave a comment. Like to get some feedback, and then we'll start to pull each of these pieces together into a more formal, cohesive whole. Thanks.